Now, of course, we used our example earlier about drinking an 8-ounce beer in 15 minutes or an 8-ounce beer over 4 hours. And what we call this is the time course of the drug. So there's several things that can affect the time course of the drug. The first is how it's administered. The second is how rapidly it's absorbed. And then the third is how it's eliminated. All of these things can affect the time course of the drug, which then in turn affects the effects the drug can have on the body. So in some cases, the effects of the drug can actually be prolonged by taking additional doses at specific time intervals. And now, depending on which drug we're talking about, the interval would definitely be different. And when we're talking about our more dangerous drugs, this can be something that can definitely lead to health issues as we look at those effects beginning to accumulate. So here is an example of how those time-dependent factors will work. If we start at the left on this chart and move to the right, we see time going by. In the purple, we see the actual concentration of the drug in the blood. So it starts down here at its lowest, and then as the drug gets metabolized, the concentration increases in the blood all the way up to its peak up here at D, and then it starts to drop off again and is eliminated at a certain point from the body. And then the red line is actually the effect of the drug. So whatever effect that drug might be having on the person's perhaps reaction time or maybe their blood pressure, really depending on what kinds of effects the drug can have when it's consumed. So that's how that looks when we graph it out. When we talk about routes of administration, we have a couple of different ways that we do administer drugs. Most of these are fairly self-explanatory: oral administration through the mouth, insufflation, intravenous injection into a vein, subcutaneous or an intramuscular injection, an injection that's not going into a blood vessel, and then inhalation. This is typically the fastest route of drug consumption. We can typically start feeling the effects from inhalation between 5 and 8 seconds. Inhalation, so this is breathing the substance into the lungs, as we can see with our graphic over here. Inhalation goes through the mouth and into the lungs. We don't often consume drugs for medical purposes this way, basically because it's difficult to control the dose that is consumed that way. We're going to talk a little bit more about insufflation, because this is the one that people tend to be least familiar with, at least by through that description. Insufflation is inhaling the drug through your nose. So we've got inhalation through the mouth and then insufflation through the nose. So interestingly, many of the effects of that are experienced through insufflation, they don't actually go to the lungs first. It's actually that the drug is absorbed into the bloodstream directly through the mucous membranes in the nose. One of the reasons this is particularly dangerous is because this route of administration does bypass the liver, so we don't see that first round of metabolism before the drug enters the bloodstream that way. So those are our different routes of administration. Inhalation goes from the mouth to the lungs. Insufflation goes from the nose to the bloodstream. Okay, so we've talked a couple of times already about the blood-brain barrier. This is that part of our brain structure made of glial cells, and its function is to protect the brain. In general, the only substances that can pass through the blood-brain barrier are small lipophilic substances. So these are substances that bond to fats. So heroin is more lipophilic than morphine, so it is easier for it to pass through the blood-brain barrier, and it ends up with a higher potency because of that. When we talk about how this actually works, the capillaries in the brain are covered with those glial cells that we covered in our previous lecture. And this makes it difficult for compounds to pass through those capillaries, to pass out and affect the brain. And we do see, though, that because that is a physical barrier, those glial cells, that certain kinds of trauma and infection can actually impair that barrier, that can limit its functionality, and we can see that resulting in more chemicals being entered the brain, which can definitely be dangerous. So when we talk about drug actions, which we'll be doing throughout the course of the semester, What we're actually talking about is the effects of drugs on those specific neurotransmitter systems that we talked about in our last lecture. So just to recap, we talked about how drugs can alter the availability of a neurotransmitter in many different ways. They can change the rate of synthesis, how easy or hard it is to create the neurotransmitter, the metabolism, the release, the reuptake, and how the drugs can also be an agonist or an antagonist. They can stimulate the drug, or they can prevent it from activating its receptors. So different ways that those drugs can affect the bodily system is based on the way it interacts with those neurotransmitters. Another important thing to talk about when we talk about drug safety is drug interactions. We definitely know that if we combine alcohol and other depressants, we're much more likely to see problems with respiratory depression, so problems breathing. And then if we combine stimulants and depressants, or uppers and downers, we can see some very complicated interactions. So there's an example here for methamphetamine and alcohol. So meth is going to lessen the performance disruptions related with alcohol, so that that slowed reaction time that we covered in a previous slide. Now alcohol is going to lessen the sleep disruptions that can be related to meth abuse. So when we put those together, rather than seeing people even out to a steady rate, we actually see a greater euphoric response than we would see from using either one of those drugs by themselves. So it's very complicated, and of course many people who abuse drugs end up abusing multiple drugs, which can lead to very complicated health problems as well. So when we talked about the definition of drug dependence, one of the things that we talked about was physical dependence, or the presence of a withdrawal symptom. And if we think back to our video on placebos, we see that people were actually experiencing withdrawal symptoms when they stopped taking a placebo. And again, this is a substance that is chemically inert. It has no actual drug components or physical effects on the body, but the brain creates these effects, these placebo effects. And people who were taking placebos for a long period of time actually experience withdrawal symptoms when they stop taking them. So thinking of this as purely physical dependence, again, it can get fairly complicated when we look at that relationship between the brain and the body. But when we talk about tolerance and withdrawal symptoms, we're looking at several different kinds of tolerance. We've got pharmacokinetic tolerance, behavioral tolerance, and pharmacodynamic tolerance. So this first one, drug disposition tolerance, what we're looking at here is the increased metabolism or excretion, which reduces the effect of a subsequent dose. So this could be related to something about the enzyme activity, or it could do something about an alteration with pH. So this is the actual disposition of the drug. And then we've got the behavioral tolerance, where we find that the drug may have a similar biochemical effect. And here we're looking at a reduced behavioral effect as the drug user learns to compensate. We actually see this with marijuana use and driving. We know that if a novice user and experienced user consume the same amount of marijuana, that the novice user is much more likely to exhibit impaired driving ability than the experienced user. So it's the same dose, and it may have the same biochemical effect on the body, but it may have an actual reduced behavioral effect. So the person is still able to, the experienced user might be more likely to drive safely. You can see how that can lead to some very complicated regulatory processes. We try to figure out, with the trend toward legalizing marijuana, what an actual safe level of consumption might look like there. So that's what behavioral tolerance would look like. And then finally, pharmacodynamic tolerance. This last type of tolerance, we've actually observed change in neurons. So after repeated drug use, the sensitivity of the neurons may change after this repeated exposure to the drug. And this may be another way that we see withdrawal symptoms exhibited when a person tries to stop using the drug. Okay, so wrapping up our lecture here today, we started out by talking about why it is that plants are our major source of drugs and how it is that people started using them. We talked about the three different kinds of names that drugs can have. They're generic, brand, and chemical names. We talked about our 6 drug categories that we'll talk about multiple drugs in each of those categories throughout the semester. And then we spent some time talking about placebos and the placebo effect when we talked about specific and non-specific effects of drugs. And finally, we talked about potency, dose response, and then the ED50 or effective dose and the LD50 or lethal dose for drugs. And then spend a little time on the blood-brain barrier as well. Thanks for being with me here today, and I will see you next time for our lecture on the next chapter.